All right.
The recording has started.
Thanks, Melissa. That's great. All right. So we've heard from 3 subcommittees. We've got 2 more to go. And then we have Jared's presentation from the Energy Action Network. And just before that, we're going to confirm what several of you have mentioned already, which is the milestones and what we're expecting or what's on the current schedule about how the subcommittees report back to you as a full council. So our next subcommittee is Agriculture and Ecosystems. And I'll let Billy and Abby take it away. And Billy, if you want to introduce yourself. Abby's already introduced herself in this meeting, but just for members of the public other who are here, that would be helpful.
Sure, thanks. Good morning. My name is Billy Koster. I'm the Director of Natural Resources Planning at ANR, and I really appreciate the opportunity to work with you all and help co-chair the subcommittee with Abby. My work at ANR focuses mainly on land use planning and regulation through Act 250, through the work of the Public Utility Commission. And I'm also a member excuse me, of the agency's leadership team and work with all of our commissioners and secretary on cross-cutting policy issues. Prior to ANR, I worked for about a decade in land conservation in both forested, agricultural, and natural landscapes, so I have a decent background for the work of the committee. And I think the way that Abby and I discussed it, I was going to briefly go through our charge and just clarify for folks what we believe our intent is, given the one meeting our group has had so far, and some slight changes to the scope from the document that Jane had circulated. And then Abby is going to kind of fill in the gaps, if that's okay. So I wonder, am I able to share my screen? Is that okay?
You should be able to, yeah.
Great. Okay, so let me know when that's up.
Yep.
Great. So I just put up the kind of the narrative scope of our subcommittee's work that Jane had put out in her document that went off to all the subcommittees. And, you know, generally we think this is consistent with the act and how we see us fitting into the process. There's a few slight changes in red that came out of our first subcommittee conversation. I'll just run through this quickly. So our first major goal is really getting a solid handle on the role of Vermont's landscape and what the role of Vermont landscapes plays in sequestering carbon. You know, the more that our landscape can help in sequestering carbon, the more time and flexibility we can provide to other sectors in meeting that net zero by 2050 target. So we really think that it's a critical piece. It's a piece that has a lot of co-benefits, as you all likely know. There's a lot of value, economic, historic, cultural, recreational in our natural and working landscapes. So to the extent that we can find additional support and value for those resources going forward and provide climate solutions, that's a top line priority for our group. We also discussed that we can't just assume that our current levels of sequestration are going to maintain over the next 30 years. As Joey indicated, you know, we're already seeing pressure from in-migration from different events around the country, and we suspect as the effects of climate change become more pronounced, we'll see more development pressure on our landscape. So we'll want to come up with programs and strategies to, at a minimum, maintain our current level of sequestration and ideally expand it. There's also some concern that as the climate changes, our natural communities will change. There will be pressure on some of our forests and natural lands that provide that sequestration. So we'll be looking at strategies to maintain the resilience of our landscape for all its uses that we currently enjoy from it, but also because of its importance as a climate solution. Along with that, you know, we'll look to see what sorts of co-benefits we can identify and maximize. If we're protecting forest land, farmland, natural areas for its climate benefits, how can we do that in a way that promotes rural economic development, clean air, clean water, other resilience goals such as flood resilience, and provides values to Vermonters broadly. And then that's kind of the sequestration adaptation piece. Our charge also includes focusing on mitigation and reducing emissions associated with the ag and forestry sectors. I think we agree with the way that the conversation was characterized earlier and our relationship with the cross-sector mitigation group. We discussed this at length at our first meeting, and there was kind of unanimous consensus amongst our group that we should take the lead on finding solutions for mitigation for ag and forestry sectors, but work very closely with the cross-sector group to understand what they need, what sorts of information is going to be most helpful, the timeline for providing that information, and kind of work collaboratively back and forth, and then hand them over some options that we feel both achieve the goals and really maximize these co-benefits. And we've also added a consideration of land conversion, the practice of taking land out of either working or natural state, and whether that's something we want to look at programs and strategies to reduce or prevent. The last piece that we discussed as a group that we'd like to put forward for your consideration is that our group could be the kind of clearinghouse for all issues related to land use. We assume there's going to be strategies related to further deployment of renewable resources, transportation network, building and growth planning. And we do have expertise within our subcommittee to help advise and vet and give guidance on those sorts of land use siting issues. So that's a role that we're open and interested in playing, if that makes sense. So that's the kind of big picture run through the scope. Abby, I don't know if you want to take it from here and kind of fill in your thoughts. I can stop sharing now.
No, I think that's a great overview. I think in light of what Rich brought up with cross-sector, we do really feel like that is going to require a lot of cross-collaboration. I mean, I think a lot of the themes that we're seeing come up today are that there is going to be a lot of cross-collaboration happening in general because this is all connected, right? So, but I guess I would just say that we do really feel like we have the requisite, both the applied experience of farmers and foresters on this committee, as well as the land use and planning and things like that could go into trying to really think holistically about the emissions and adaptation and mitigation of natural and working lands and how that ties into the emissions reductions more broadly. I think that's really, I think the nice thing that we realized in some ways is that through a lot of the work with, or at least this is my take, through a lot of the work with water quality and required agricultural practices and things like that, at the very least, these conversations have begun within the state at the level of farming and forestry. And so I think we are at least feeling optimistic and hopeful that there is, that this is a space for a lot of opportunity and growth. The other thing that we thought was going to be really critical and was brought up actually in a public comment as well is the incorporation of really thoughtful thinking and a specific focus on food systems and food access, food security, as to how that pertains to the natural and working lands, where conserved land bases are, farm easements are, things like that, and how that ties into the resilience of our community structures. But I think that that's really all that I would add at this point, is that became a really critical component as well.
Right. Okay. That's very, very helpful and quite clear. I wonder, council members, questions for these co-chairs as they go forward with this mandate, this charge, things that we need to clear up, questions we have.
We'll likely reach out to the cross-sector group in short order to find a time for our two groups, or at least the co-chairs, to get together to talk about how we work together.
That's great. Thanks. Lauren?
Yeah, thanks, David. Thank you, Billy and Abby. That was a really good summary of the work that we did in just one meeting to date. I just want to add, it was brought up earlier during the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, their scope, the nature-based solutions and the role that they play, that we're going to be working on that within our group as well, as we consider impacts from climate change largely in the form of natural hazards, which typically are in the form of flooding in Vermont, and which, I mean, Leslie Ann can speak better to this than I can, but we intend to see more frequent, higher precipitation events in the future. So we'll be working on the role that our natural and working lands can play to adapt to climate change at the community scale as well.
Great. That's great. Catherine?
I just wanted to put out there that I appreciate that this committee has added land use to their list, and just note that the Rural Resilience Committee also has that as part of our charge. So figuring out how we divvy that up, collaborate, and work together on that is going to be really crucial. And I see Abby nodding her head, so thank you.
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think I always have a difficult time separating out the reality that, of course, there is a future and possibilities and progress in urban farming, but largely, right, this is, as Leslie Ann said in her first presentation, this is a largely rural state, and most of our farmland is quite rural. So certainly the rural resilience piece is deeply embedded in the work that we do, and I foresee us working closely together moving forward.
Right. Okay. Are there pieces of that coordination that we want to clear up right now? Are there other sort of questions of clarity we want to work on?
I think in general, and I sense maybe this is coming from some of the other subcommittees too, but I do feel like, if I'm remembering correctly, it came up just sort of the orchestration of all of this is feeling quite daunting, big. And you know, obviously all of this cross collaboration is going to be really critical and integral to the work, but just sort of the logistics of how that all happens is definitely something that we're, I think, foreseeing as a, you know, as a piece that we're going to have to really think about, and any guidance in that regard is definitively welcome.
Yep. This is a tricky one. Yep. I know Jane's been thinking a lot about that as well. And so I don't know if we want to say anything about that now, Jane, or just note that as this a challenge that has to be addressed.
Yeah, I think for now I'm just going to leave it at that, and want everybody to know that between Melissa, myself, the secretary, and the steering committee, I think we'll be thinking a lot about that going forward, and the immediate need to sort of bring some clarity to some of the roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, and I guess I would add, you know, we thought broadly about what we thought our scope should be, and I'm sure all the other subcommittees have done that. At some point, there should just be a general reckoning of what, in fact, our respective scopes are. And there may be areas of overlap, and if so, let's be intentional about those, because I think given what we need to get done on this timeline, we're going to have really clear sense of what our responsibilities are and where those responsibilities lay with others.
Right. Chris, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, one thing I'll just note, I'm sure Catherine's probably noted this in the Rural Resilience Subcommittee. You know, especially like around all the regional planning commissions, and then some municipalities have already developed really detailed regional energy plans that are based off the Comprehensive Energy Plan and various other commissions and studies. And specifically, the point of the regional energy plans was to you know, the Department of Public Service actually developed standards that the plans had to meet in order for the plans collectively to achieve the state's energy goals. And then a lot of our other work, you know, the primary planning goal for regions and municipalities is to have compact settlement patterns surrounded by rural countryside. Not sure what other kind of countryside you'd have, but ours is rural. But a lot of the planning has been done. And so one of the things that might be helpful is actually looking at how do you actually implement the plans, because that's the challenge, especially in the Vermont context, where planning is incredibly diffuse, and where those who are oftentimes, you know, most responsible for developing the plans don't actually have the capacity or the resources and the mission to actually implement them. And to me, I think they're again going back to the comment I made with the cross sector committee. again, there's some things there that we just know need to be done, and so hopefully we can look at those things that need to be done, and then kind of back our way back out as far as like what are the policy solutions to make those things happen. And the other thing I've talked about the regional energy plans and town energy plans. We also have local hazard mitigation plans for most communities in the state. We know what, at a fairly granular level, what the issues are. So again, a lot of, at a fairly high level of granularity, we know what the issues are. So I think the task is how do we back our way back out of that and into, actually accomplishing them. So just wanted to note that. Maybe at some point, I don't want to put Catherine on the spot, but maybe she and I can present to the group, just kind of an overview of what planning is already out there at the regional and local level and how those plans might be able to help inform this larger conversation. I know, early on the state discussed what plans it had developed. And so maybe we can drill down a bit further, at the more granular level about regional and local planning.
Okay. When folks from the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee hear that from Chris, how do you see that being helpful to your process? All that regional planning work that's going on.
I think information is helpful. I also think that certainly the Regional Planning Commission structure and the way that it's handled within municipalities, et cetera, is not something with which I have a ton of familiarity. So certainly, even if it's Chris, if we decide that that's something that you and I need, however we structure that, I am a big fan of not reinventing the wheel. So certainly if the work has already been done somewhere else and given the deadline that we're under, I don't feel the need to rework any of that. I'm happy to start from the place that we have and see how that fits with the goals that we have and the structures that we're looking at and see how we can move forward from that place. I just, I guess I don't have a deep familiarity with that structural system. So that would be knowledge I would need to gain.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts from Billy or Lauren or Sophia?
I see Catherine raised her hand. So Catherine, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to note that although that work has been done, I see it as a starting point and not an ending point. And I don't think that Chris was suggesting it was the ending point either, but there is a lot of groundwork that was put into those plans, and utilizing that as much as possible would be super helpful. They were, of course, done under a whole different framework and for a somewhat entirely different reason than the work that we're doing today. So we have to look at what was done in the context of what we're trying to achieve in this council. But there is a lot of groundwork that can serve as a starting point.
That's great. Thanks, Catherine. Secretary.
I was just going to say, I think in general that fits in with sort of how we're hoping to approach it as well. With, like I said, there's a lot of this work that in the agricultural space and the ecosystem space as well that has begun. And so how do we take what's there and formulate it to, encapsulate the goals of this council and move forward with it, as opposed to trying to start from ground zero.
That's great. Secretary Young.
Hi, thank you. Me again, talking about kind of the order of things, because again, we've touched on it in this conversation, and I was just kind of running through the actual written document, and I'm not sure this made it into the document in terms of objectives, but again, I'm looking at the statute now. And one of the first things the council is supposed to do is create an inventory of all existing programs in this space. And that's what I hear us all talking about. There's work that's already been done. And so for me, the most critical thing feels like having that inventory be the first order of business for each subcommittee to bring to the council. And we can talk about that at some point. But until we know where we've been, it's hard to know where to go. And this is, I think, precisely the process that ended up resulting in the Clean Water Board being created, looking at where have we been, what have we spent, what goals have we achieved, and then what is the gap? What do we really need to work on to fill in our full, like for then it was the clean water portfolio. So I'm hearing I'm hearing that we maybe should really just think intentionally too about what's that inventory in all of these spaces? What does it look like? What's worked? What hasn't? And build off of all the work that's been done. Because if we start from scratch, I think we all agree we'll be here for years. And we have a short time frame. So thank you.
Thank you. That's great. Chris?
And just the other piece I've asked before, at some point it would be helpful to hear from the state how, because there may be some synergies here that could help, or maybe not, but would be good to hear how does the work of the council ultimately mesh with the update of the comprehensive energy plan? Because those two have to kind of intermesh, and I'm not sure how. And I know it's not necessarily an easy thing, but there may be some opportunities for the whole to be greater than the sum of the parts if there's opportunity for coordination in these two efforts. Maybe not, but one of the things under Act 174 that enabled the regional planning commissions to develop the regional energy plans is that the regional energy plans are supposed to inform the next iteration of the comprehensive energy plan. So, and we're having conversations with Department of Public Service about what that looks like. But anyway, just wanted to put that could be a parking lot issue. We don't have to resolve that now, but just wanted to throw that out there again.
Thanks, Chris. I'm glad you did. And I think Jane made some reference to it as well this morning. I think it's definitely something on people's minds. And, you know, we have June here as well, part of the council. So it can be helpful in that. In fact, her hand is up.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your throwing the microphone my way for just a moment, David. I too have heard this come up several times in our council so far, and I welcome that because I think everybody sees that there is an intersection here that is inevitable. I do want that to be a very structured conversation, though, because the legislation does not meld the two. In retrospect, one might have wished it did, but it does not. What it says is that the comprehensive energy plan has to be consistent with the work of this council. And one way to read that is that the work of the council needs to be complete before the plan is fully undertaken. Another way to read it is that the council's work must be complete and then the plan has to be adapted to it. And then there's another way to read it, which I think is what people here are thinking, which is, why don't we just do them all at once? And I don't read the statute that way. The department has a vision role here in terms of planning for the totality of the state's energy resources, not just the parts that intersect with the work of this council. And so I'm open to having that conversation. I want to realize synergies and efficiencies as much as possible, but I want to be clear that the Department of Public Service work as the leading planner on energy in the state has not been folded into the mission of this council. So we need to have a parallel course of conversation, but at this time, they are not simply conflated.
Okay. Right, that's helpful. Raises questions of what that structured process looks like, but is a helpful framing.
Indeed, and I'm not sure it's a parking lot issue the way Chris has phrased it, though I think that may well be what evolves. I just want to be sure that we don't just casually assume that we can just blend it all together. The two functions are, if nothing else, legally distinct, and that's a boundary that the department needs to mind. But I don't mean in any way, shape, or form to suggest that we're not open to having robust conversation, discussion, etc. But it needs to be structured so that we have a shared understanding and not fond hopes that then lead to disappointment among the council members.
Gene, my point about parking it was not to try to resolve it at 10:50 this morning.
I agree with you completely, Chris.
Okay, so that is an issue that's going to need some work, right? In terms of what that process looks like. Jane's flagged that as something that needs to get developed. And that's something perhaps also your steering committee can play a role in helping to shape, because that falls squarely into their mandate of helping to structure the process and making the process work. Okay. So to round up the ag and ecosystems, is there anything else we need to say specifically to that subcommittee before we go into our last subcommittee of the day?
I just want to apologize for the internet crash in my presentation on that.
Okay, great. Yeah. All right. So thank you, Billy. Thank you, Abby. That seems quite clear. Let's go on to our final for today presentation on the Science and Data Subcommittee. We have Leslie Ann and TJ. I think TJ's here. And just for the benefit of folks who might be listening in, if you could present yourselves, and then lay out how you see your charge for this Science and Data Subcommittee. So Leslie Ann and TJ, I turn it.
Thanks, David. So good morning, everyone. Leslie Ann Dupini-Giroux. I am a professor in the Geography Department at the University of Vermont. I'm also the Vermont State Climatologist and president of the American Association of State Climatologists. My background is in severe weather, severe hazards, particularly flooding and droughts, and I'm actually teaching the hazards class that fed into the 2013 State Hazard Mitigation Plan. So it's nice to hear all of these connections sort of coming back, and folks who were involved in that might remember all of the things that you sort of brought to bear. So our committee met last Friday evening. We were the last ones to meet and echo a lot of the things that have been said so far in terms of the excuse me, in terms of tabling a couple of things like some of the roles of the committee members until we have a full committee on board. I do want to acknowledge that we had eight members of the public join us, and I see in the chat that a lot of them are with us today. So I thank you for your ongoing participation and support of the work of the council. We had another 6 agency staff join us, some of them for the first time. So that was great to actually see that. And so some of the high-level things that I wanted us to sort of present and think about from a science and data perspective are looking at climate change, the current climate change that's sort of coming down the line as we look back and look at the things that have been done in the past and the things that have been created in inventories. To go back to Richard's point of what some of this might look like from a technological or from a science perspective 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line, we sort of need to keep our eye on the prize in terms of some of that science, some of that data. And in particular, when we think about climate change, sort of making sure that we're doing it in a holistic perspective. So water extremes, floods and droughts are critical, but so are pieces of air quality, as we heard one of the groups mentioned, human health, extreme temperatures, how those play out for us, how they play out for us from a geographic perspective. So looking at that and making sure we're using the best science as possible. In thinking about the way in which the Science and Data Committee fits into all of this, because we're not written into the statute, we see a lot of what we are doing or could be doing or will be doing as working directly and interactively and iteratively with all of the subcommittees, and thinking about it by putting the peoples first, because that's the reason why we're doing a lot of this. How do we frame the use of science in a way that makes sense for all of the peoples that we are trying to work to better serve? And as we look at this and work with some of the other subcommittees, pieces that I think may be distinct to the Science and Data Committee are monitoring, evaluation, and setting up some of the metrics and guideposts for the progress once the plan has been in place. How do we continue to look at that moving forward in a way that helps us to move the needle, move the dial in mitigation, adaptation, community and landscape resilience. And so some of the specific expertise that we're going to be looking forward to bringing on board, because we need to have an ongoing discussion about this, are economic modeling, climate resiliency pieces, in particular, the atmospheric pieces in here, and the way in which a lot of this, when we do that iterative pieces, some of it needs to be a little bit of scaffolding, because two of the pieces of the charge called out the energy use and emissions baseline. Another piece called out working directly with the cross-sector mitigation committee. Our conversation is moving us towards how do we work with all of the subcommittees and all of the pieces. And I think we'll have a somewhat clearer aspect on what that charge looks like when we meet on Wednesday. So those are some of my high-level pieces, and I want to invite other members of the subcommittee to please fill in for anything else that I might have missed, or things that we discussed or are still discussing, but please feel free to chime in. So our co-chair is TJ Poore. We also have Secretary Moore, Brian Gray, and Jared Duval on our committee.
Great. So do other committee members want to jump in?
David, if I might just say something briefly also, and thank you, Leslie Ann, for summarizing the subcommittee meeting so well. I'm TJ Poore. I wanted to introduce myself. I'm the Director of Efficiency and Energy Resources at the Department of Public Service. Very excited to be involved. My background includes working on our previous and the ongoing comprehensive energy plan, but the total energy study and the modeling that went into that ahead of development of the plan. And I had a lot of experience in evaluation and reporting in the efficiency world that I think will be translatable here. And I just wanted to underscore the point Leslie Ann made about the iterative process between subcommittees and raise that. We specifically have called out in our charter the build the scenarios based on the work of the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. We do think that will bring, we'll need to engage all of the subcommittees, but as it pertains to that subcommittee, we're need to create a business as usual scenario and create scenarios and do modeling going forward on the pathways. And that's going to be very iterative back and forth. We see the policies recommended by a cross-sector subcommittee, do some analysis, and then there's likely to be some back and forth there and going forward. So just again, wanted to underscore that that point. And the committee, our subcommittee, is blessed with a lot of experience in this area between Jared Duval, the EAN data gathering and infrastructure of that network, the department and its energy plan modeling, and Agency of Natural Resources with its greenhouse gas mitigation. But Leslie Ann pointed out the need, we'll be looking at pulling in members for more economic analysis and a few other areas related to the science aspect of it as well. So with that, I'll leave it open to other subcommittee members or others.
That's helpful. Other members of the subcommittee want to put a finer point on any of what was said so far? Oh, good. Okay. One question that comes to my mind, obviously, is how you all will interact with, but synergistic with the work of technical consultants that get brought on. And I don't know whether Secretary Moore or Jane wants to say anything about the vision of how you see that working, the role of the subcommittee is the role of consultants.
Yeah, I'm going to highlight that too when we talk a little bit more about milestones at the end of the subcommittee conversation, but I will just point out that you'll notice in the milestones section of the document that you all have been reviewing and working off of, that many folks have contributed to at this point, that There's special attention to the next Climate Council meeting in March around not only finalizing your charge, but also articulating the role of how the needs will be for the technical services on contract. So I see the next month, now that we've gone through the RFI and have reviewed all the proposals, as sort of a critical time in the development of the RFPs that will go out for technical services. And that particularly pertains to the Science and Data Committee. And I think we'll have regular ongoing conversations about what we're asking for through those RFPs with this group in particular, but also with cross-sector and more widely as well.
Okay. Are there other thoughts for this subcommittee? Folks from the council, questions? Right, this is the one that wasn't specifically in the legislative mandate you all, and emerged from your conversations of being something important. Is there anything else you all want to say about it? That's great. Okay. And just one last thing for the co-chairs and members of the subcommittee, are there any other questions you have for the full council at this point as you're getting going? Anything else that's bugging you that you'd want to check in with your fellow councilors on this?
Was that a question for us, David?
Yeah, that's the question for you. Yeah, absolutely.
No, I am just so looking forward to working with all of the subcommittees, because as a geographer, this is what we do, and it's sort of like putting all the pieces together. So it's like a Rubik's Cube. So I'm just trying to see how all they fit. So yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. Okay. All right. This is great. We're a few minutes ahead. That's wonderful. What we wanted to do before we go to Jared's presentation on the Energy Action Network is we wanted to just emphasize the pathway forward, the milestones, the sort of what everyone should expect over the coming months. And Jane, you were going to share either the document or a slide on this, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll turn it over to you if you want to walk folks through that. And I see you sharing the screen. Excellent.
Yeah. Everybody able to see that?
Yep. It looks great.
Okay. So I just wanted to give a moment and pause and make sure we have particular attention to the milestones at the end of the document as you're charting a course forward for the subcommittee work, and just call attention to the specific dates that have been articulated in order to meet the deadline to develop the climate action plan this fall. And then also just sort of reflect the iterative process around the contractual services that will be available to you with respect to the different phases of the project, whether it's the development of RFPs and then what it'll actually take to get those services up and running on contract. So first, just thinking about major milestones. I think that this has been said in all of the specific subcommittees, but we're striving for this Friday to finalize your membership, recognizing that by Wednesday morning, you'll all have that prioritized list of nominees. But we also don't want you to feel, I hope I don't speak out of turn, but I do want to just suggest that if you're still working through and thinking about your due diligence to get the right committee membership, and you don't meet February 26th, that's okay, but it's also important to recognize that that doesn't mean that you can't move forward with the important work that your subcommittee needs to be doing through the month of March. So if you're still struggling with finalizing those few select spots, so be it. But let's strive for this Friday and also recognize that there can be this parallel path of implementation of work for the subcommittee while also finalizing subcommittee membership. We drew out subcommittee work groups formed, and this was with specific attention to the cross-sector mitigation. I think that I left this in here for this slide today, and I didn't hear Richard or Commissioner Walk speak to this today, but I will say that what I heard in my participation in that subcommittee is that you're thinking about work groups differently, perhaps, than was originally maybe proposed, recognizing that your subcommittee needs more expertise than perhaps some of the others to really get at all the sectors. So we had called out mid-March for identifying those work groups, but I'll just offer a chance for either of you to speak up now and suggest what you're thinking about, and then hold the floor if any other subcommittees are recognizing that they might need work groups beyond the actual subcommittee. And we're hoping that would be by mid-March. So I'll just leave it at that for a minute and see if anybody has anything to say.
Thanks, Jane. I'll jump in. That's a great point. Again, Peter Walk. One of the things we've been thinking about is our subcommittees are a nice, manageable size group, but it doesn't really offer enough to sort of form fully fledged subgroups from within there. And so we're looking at appointing a lead or two or potentially three as needed on each of the 5 topics that Rich went over. And that, I think, will give us the ability for that person or persons to be able to sort of organize our outreach in that space, bring in the wealth of expertise and voices that we need to be successful without and be somewhat more nimble than a work group would be. So I think that's kind of where we're going, rather than we may need to form work groups, but at this point we just sort of have, given the timeline, we think that it's sort of better to give that charge to 1 or 2 people with the outreach and sort of concentric circles model in mind.
That's great. Anybody else with other subcommittees and thinking about the role of work groups? Okay, hearing none. So there's a recognition that with the bulk of what we'll be thinking about for the next time we come together as a council in March will be this finalization of your subcommittee charge, perhaps taking it a step further. And we should think about this with the steering committee about how that final subcommittee charge is presented. But I heard Erica suggest earlier, perhaps this would be in a form of a work plan, which sounded really great to me, but we'll vet that with the steering committee and expect that however we move forward with presentation of it, you will have solidified what your charge is for your specific subcommittee by the March Climate Council meeting. As well as this next month, we'll be working closely with myself and others to think about the specific contractual needs with respect to technical services, just to highlight and remind everybody and draw your attention to the other smaller chart on the right. We had the RFI that Billy Coster here was gracious enough when I wasn't hired yet to advance on the agency's behalf. We received 15 proposals from both obviously in-state contractors and consultants, as well as far away as California and beyond, with respect to proposals helping us to understand what they saw as needs for our technical services. I've vetted all of those and read through them and highlighted the ability of each of those proposals to meet the 8 specific things that were called out in the RFI. And this week I begin the process of working with you all to vet those proposals and consider how we want to move forward with an RFP or multiple RFPs to meet those contractual needs. Our hope is that after the council meeting in March, like within the next day or two, we'll be positioned to move forward with the RFPs for technical services, which would put us at the end of March to advance those. Thinking about a 2-week turnaround, that would mean we would have them back sometime mid-April and hopefully have those contractual services in place by the end of April to really start to move forward, advancing the work of the subcommittees in May. So that's the timeline for the technical services. And at the same time in April, you will have been ready to present to the April council meeting potential pathways and strategies that you'll be teeing up to then work with the contractors in May with to start to do some analysis on. The May meeting, you're really already getting at the meat of what your framework and strategies will be, and really starting to look at what will be included in the climate action plan. the month of June will really be around that first sort of vetting, real thoughtful vetting around public engagement, mindful that if we've been doing our job well, we've been starting that all along, but June is the time where we go out and test the framework and strategies through a public engagement process with the help of both the RFP for engagement and outreach, as well as our facilitation contractual services. And I'll just mention those two with respect to, we got 5 proposals back for the facilitation services. Those have gone out to a small committee within the agency, and Secretary Moore and I are going to speak today about the potential to share. I have shared those with all of you. I think if I haven't, I will, for comments. And we have a ranking criteria put forward in the proposal that will review and rank those 5 proposals. And we hope to make our selection by the end of this week for a facilitator, and then have a seamless transition from when our sole source with CBI goes through the first week of March. So have a seamless transition, have a contract in place for facilitation as the sole source with CBI ends in the beginning of March. The RFP, which we've talked about earlier today quite a bit around engagement and outreach and marketing, is open now, open for 2 weeks. And once we get that back, those proposals as well as go out for a contract, it'll likely be the end of March till when we have a contract in place for engagement and outreach. And then just to find through, you know, really the bulk of the work for the subcommittees is through June, but then there'll be this summertime process where we are hearing from public, we're revising our framework and strategies, we're preparing recommendations, and really thinking thoughtfully about financing options to present to the July council meeting, as well as then continuing to work to knit together all of that into a draft climate action plan for September, at which point we have the bulk of that public engagement again around that draft climate action plan in October and a final plan by November. So that's the timeline, as rough as can be, put forward in this framework and the document that you have, and just milestones for you all to be thinking about. And I welcome any questions or comments on how I've presented it, and urge others who have been thinking about this longer than I have even to really step up and hit anything that I might have missed or thought about. And I see Secretary Young's hand is up, so why don't I give the floor to her? Thank you.
Well, just a couple points of clarification, Jane.
Thank you.
Where is the next point for this steering committee here? Is it after the subcommittee membership is finalized? Does it have a role in that? I was trying to remember from the draft process plan.
Yeah, well, we've been thinking about this. Well, we should revisit this with the steering committee directly, but we've been thinking at the very least, the steering committee is meeting bi-weekly to stay abreast of everything that's happening, as well as serving obviously as a voice for the full council when the full council isn't meeting on approval and recognition of the work that's happening.
And then secondarily, just the March meeting of the Climate Council, the full council. I believe we adopted or agreed that our regular meetings would be the 4th Monday of the month.
Yes.
Okay, so that will be March 22. That's good to know, because there's 5 Mondays this month. Okay, so March 22nd, so folks have that in mind. And then I will just comment on moving through and the fact that there's now the notion of including financing options relatively early on in this work, and I would just comment that that seems a bit premature if we haven't gone through the inventorying and planning and looking at different strategies. So anyway, I mean, we definitely need to cost things out before we can understand what our financing options should look like. So I'm not quite sure where evaluating the cost effectiveness of any particular strategy falls into this process map or major milestones.
Yeah,
I'm happy to respond to that.
perfect.
Yeah.
Rich. Thank you.
Well, financing and access to capital is broader than budgeting.
Mhm.
And for example, the Transportation Climate Initiative inherently includes a financing aspect in terms of how it would work, and so too does any consideration of climate related or carbon taxes. So those are policy pathways that involve a consideration of how things get paid for. So does a renewable portfolio standard. So does Tier 3. I mean, there's financing practicalities associated with any of the major pathways that we would be considering. So I think that's what we had in mind as opposed to what is typically considered pure government finance.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And Jane, I've got a question for you about the timeline. We've been operating, and Peter's been pushing us as a committee to be prepared to present ideas to the full council in May. And I'm struggling to figure out how we use the technical consultants to help us evaluate different policy options. If they're not getting on board until April.
Yeah.
So I just am confused as to, what are you thinking about how we could use technical consultants to help us evaluate, some of these really complicated policy options?
Yeah, well, I encourage others to speak up around that also, but I will suggest that obviously things are going to have a struggle lining up. And so I think that as fast as we can move with respect to getting the technical services in place, we will. But we recognize that really it means you'll have the month of May to do data analysis. And we heard loud and clear through every proposal pretty much from the RFI that the timeline is near impossible. I mean, I thought about sharing quotes from them, and of course they weren't specific on suggesting an alternative timeline that could work, but they were just not any of them didn't mention within their proposal that what we were trying to achieve with respect to getting them on contract and having analyses done in such short order will be very hard to meet. So I don't know what else to say around that, but recognize that there is going to be a cross at some point in timeline, and services and how we do it well is going to be challenging. So I saw Secretary Moore's hand up too, and she might want to speak to that comment specifically.
Yeah, no, I think, Jane, you did a nice job sort of just recognizing that this is going to be probably one of the most significant challenges in meeting the December 1st deadline is being able to utilize the resources that we anticipate are going to be provided to the council through the Budget Adjustment Act in a way that is then able to be reflected in the climate action plan. And it may be as we get these contractors for technical services online that we have to then, in light of the schedules that we're able to come to with the different contractors, think about what that means in terms of the overall scope and content of the action plan. But I think the way Jane's laid it out here is really important, just in recognizing that we are unlikely to have those contracted services available to us till the end of April, which means unlikely to benefit from having answers to the questions we would likely pose to them for several months after that point in time.
Right. And I know, Sue, you've had your hand up, and before we go, I just want to, if folks want to continue on this conversation for 1 second on the timing issue, because this is, if you look at other states and how other states have done it, this is probably quite a bit more accelerated. And having just coming out of the main process, they're equivalent to your subcommittees, their working groups, had a similar challenge where the technical expertise really wasn't there in time for them in their work. And it came later in the process as the full council was reviewing the work of the subcommittees. It is a probable scenario that you may find the same thing. So you may not have that analysis ready to go while you're presenting as subcommittees to the council, but then the full council pulls in the work and the analysis, right? So I think that's a likely outcome given just the velocity that this timeline suggests. Sue, you've been patient. Was your comment around this issue or something else?
It's related, but I didn't know, Rich Coward, if you wanted to, I saw your hand go up. Was it in response to this point? I defer to you.
So, well, let me just respond to you. And in fact, we may be thinking on similar veins. It not only does this time frame with respect to technical assistance mean that the subcommittees would be asked to come up with policy proposals without the technical assistance that these contractors would provide, which is a challenge, as just pointed out. But I'm concerned that we would be launching a public engagement process around ideas that, for which we have not developed a number of the important details that members of the public would want to know. Like, how would this work, and how much would it cost, and what kind of institutions would be involved in implementing the proposals. So it isn't just a question of burdening the subcommittee with trying to come up with their menu of proposals without technical assistance. It's also potentially depriving the public of the information that the public would want to have available in order to decide what they think about the ideas that are being vetted. So I want to make sure that we actually have solid information to put in front of members of the public before we're out there running proposals past people.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Sue?
Well, it's true that my point was about public engagement, but it was actually more different from Rich's, because I think he, and I think the sort of way that we're framing this up, thinks about public engagement as this, after we've come up with our ideas, then we need to sort of see the public reaction. And what I'm trying to see is whether we can actually develop engagement different from, hey, what do you think of what we're doing, earlier and as soon as possible, in a different way, in a strategic way, with folks who we haven't really reached out to effectively in the past. So I am hoping that the kind of engagement that the Just Transitions Subcommittee will hopefully help work on precedes June, and it starts as soon as possible. And I'm very interested, speaking of June, of maybe connecting with Commissioner Tierney, because perhaps it's the comprehensive energy plan outreach kind of work that she seems to be interested in that could help bridge that. That's what I wanted to mention.
Interesting.
David, can I?
Yeah.
Or without offending, you haven't exactly given me the rubber chicken, and I'm asking for permission. So thank you. That's a really helpful remark, and the things we've been saying this morning, I think, have served to clarify the need. At least there are some people here, I think most people probably, who are reaching for this same sort of juncture. I'm not sure that it is the actual outreach of the CEP that can serve this purpose. But what I'm thinking is something that I really have no idea if this is kosher or if it's way off the reservation. But what I'm hearing you say is we need to know now. We need input now from the folks we don't ordinarily reach, not later. And the only thing that comes to mind in my crabbed world, and I apologize for this, is some sort of focus group. And I know that that kind of work is done by people in other contexts, like advertising, for instance. And maybe we are looking for something like that. And the reason I dare say it out loud is because my good friend Abby Course on the call has been encouraging me to just be myself and lead, just as she's just being herself and leading. And I heard Sophie very clearly say earlier how she is struggling to be the voice of youth on this committee. And yet that appears to be what the legislature has sort of contemplated in having exactly one person representing the youth perspective. So I know there is science behind focus groups, and maybe that would be a path to go. And I am certainly very open to other ideas people have. I am just feeling a little guarded about the comprehensive energy plan process, because that is a statutory obligation the department has had for many years and continues to bear, that was not modified when this legislation creating this council was passed. And there's some tension there for me. So do folks have reactions to this focus group concept? Perhaps would be how I would approach it, and get that done now.
Thanks. Sue, do you want to continue on that?
I definitely think focus groups are an important strategy / tactic. And, what we would be doing at this point is much more, I guess I'll use the word outreach and maybe even empowerment for people who haven't had the agency to participate in this work. And that's different from responding to our ideas. It's and so I think that is one strategy. I guess what I think would be helpful, and I certainly don't want to tie down the comprehensive energy plan in any way. I simply wonder if there, and maybe it is, a philanthropic initiative that we pay for in a different way that is sort of trying to penetrate these barriers that exist. Now, as opposed to, but how do we raise the money and how do we do that? That's a lot to ask, but willing to try to do that if really what we're prescribing in the work that's the RFP's underway, and I'm just honing in on this issue of public engagement, is really around after we've come up with our ideas. For the work we're trying to do at Just Transitions, that's too late. And I would love there to be room for thoughtful engagement now, but if we have to raise the money from another world to try to do that, better to know that now than knock heads against a brick wall.
Yeah, I hear you on that, because what I hear you saying very clearly is we need to engage people, empower them, create agency where perhaps there hasn't been that before, and participation for folks who have felt marginalized, how to bring them in now, not down the road once we know what we think. I love every single word you used, Sue. And I'm beginning to think that what you're talking about is a form of re-engineering how government interacts with the people it serves that is long overdue. And it's starting to feel to me a little like we are, before long, we're going to pile so many expectations about how to do this so well that it's going to collapse under its own weight. And so a lawyerly thought came to me, which was perhaps we should think about how to create a carve out in our product that envisions that kind of engagement for revisiting our product in due course, because we risk having the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think we could do more in terms of what you're talking about, but I don't think we're going to be able to do everything you're talking about. So I mean to say focus group now, if that helps. And forgive me, David, I will now be quiet.
So we need to close up this conversation. I want to make sure we finish with those folks who have their hands up. So Catherine, and then Abby, and then Secretary Young. Catherine first.
I'll try to be brief, but I have lots of swirling thoughts. First, I want to say I agree with absolutely everything that our last two speakers said, both June and Sue. And I think we need to remember that we also have a lot of people who are traditionally engaged in this topic who want to have a voice too. So how do we balance those who are traditionally engaged and desire to participate and their ease of participation with our desire to ensure that those who don't typically participate have a voice? So I think we need to figure that out sooner rather than later. And I would suggest that our current method of having a brief public comment period at the end of our council meetings is not cutting it, and that we need to fix that sooner rather than later. We've had different people have tossed out ideas, even having something on the website where people can offer comments and throw something in. And I do think we need to correct that sooner rather than later. And also think we need to look at our subcommittee work. If we're not going to have our engagement outreach person available until the end of March, but we're working on our pathways, we need to think about how our subcommittees can do their own engagement or should do their own engagement. So those are my thoughts, in addition to seconding everything that Sue and June said.
Thanks, Catherine. Abby?
I don't know if this is relevant, but I was just thinking about processes that I've been a part of within the ag world that have felt a little bit more successful than others. And I know that certainly there was a lot of tension and a lot of difficulty, we'll say, around the RAPs. But at the same time, there was a lot of, I felt, good outreach strategy on the part of the Agency of Agriculture. And in terms of coming, COVID makes this tricky, but coming to different parts of the state, having deep, in-depth conversations during the process. And so I don't know if, again, in the interest of not reinventing the wheel, but maybe that's a process that we could look at how, I can't remember if Chuck started it and Anson took it over or how that worked, but Anson, I know for sure, has done a lot of, he's been to our farm. That's just such an enormous thing that I can't begin to say. And I think that that's really critical in this. You're never going to make everyone happy, but the key is to find a little bit of a different way in the process to at least help a broader majority of people feel like they can engage in the process in some sort of meaningful way and feel heard. So maybe that was just what I wanted to throw out there.
Great, that's very helpful. Secretary Young, last word on this?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate this conversation, and it really is important to Sue. I understand. I think what you're saying is not to get reaction; it's to get actual, real input and contributions. And if we weren't in COVID, I would be asking you, how do we get boots on the ground out in the communities to do this? And that's my frustration here is, how do we do this in such a way that we get what we need without actually being out in the community, which is really important. So I don't know if it's something the Just Transitions Committee wants to think about a little more, maybe go back to, Susanna Davis's presentation where she gave us some helpful hints, and maybe come to the steering committee with like an action plan, or if you want a consultant, as you suggested, then maybe start teeing that up. But I agree we should get started with it, what everybody has said about doing it right and doing it sooner.
Right. Okay. So this is a hard conversation just to summarize. So I feel like, we've taken good notes on it. There is clearly work to do that the Just Transition Subcommittee is going to be taking a lead in, that Jane and others are going to have to step up. And I think the steering committee, as you're suggesting, Secretary Young, is a good place to keep that momentum going in between the council meetings. Okay, so I would recommend you use the steering committee as a place to keep that momentum going, and the Just Transition Subcommittee is really leading the charge as well. Okay, so I don't want to crush our time slot here for this last piece, and there's a lot to think about. What we just did is crazy aggressive. You guys are going to have to come to terms with that at some point. But let's switch gears and and hear from Jared. The steering committee thought this was going to be a really good framing for the work ahead. And so Jared, let me just turn it over to you. And I'll give you a nod or a heads up as we're getting to about 25, 30 minutes. So we make sure we have some time for conversation, 15, 20 minutes of conversation at the end. So Jared, I turn it over to you. I see you're sharing a screen. Go ahead, please.
Great. Thanks, David, and thanks, everybody. Good morning. Just by way of introduction, for those I don't know, I serve as Executive Director of Energy Action Network, the nonprofit organization, and was appointed on the council to represent an organization, a Vermont-based organization with expertise in energy and data analysis. Just briefly, previous to joining EAN, I served as Economic Development Director at the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, where I focused on our working lands and green economy sectors. So in the next half hour, I want to pick up on a lot of the threads that have come up today and throughout our work together, and try to start weaving some of them together. Certainly not all of them, but just to try to set some common context and frameworks for our work as we go into the next phase. In the next half hour, I'm going to focus on where our emissions come from, both by sector and also through some different lenses, including by income. I want to focus on the primary solutions that we already have at hand, proven and available technologies and best practices, and the rough scale and pace that has already been modeled of what it will likely take to meet our emissions reduction requirements, specifically in the energy sectors, where about 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from. And then finally, I really want to focus on questions of the economy and equity, and the both how inequitable and costly our current energy system is, and the potential benefits in terms of equity and the economy to Vermont and Vermonters through this transition. Before I dive into that, let me first just, again, for those who may not be familiar, introduce EAN and the role that we play in Vermont. And I need to start by saying first, there are two EANs. There is EAN, the network, and EAN, the nonprofit organization. And EAN, the network, consists of a very broad and diverse array of over 200 nonprofits, businesses, utilities, and energy service providers, community action agencies, departments, regional planning commissions, on and on and on. Any entity in the state of Vermont that wants to be part of helping our state meet its energy and climate goals in a way that helps create a more just, thriving, and sustainable future for Vermonters. That is the network as a whole. In support of that network and the state of Vermont, there also exists a small nonprofit organization, what we call a backbone organization, that exists to serve two key roles. One is as a neutral convener of that diverse network, because while there is a broadly shared mission about meeting Vermont's energy and climate goals, there are differences of opinion across our membership, across Vermont, about what are the short or the near term and the medium term steps to get there. So as a neutral convener, to create that trust in that gathering space, we commit not to doing any lobbying on specific policies before the legislature, or proceedings before the Public Utilities Commission. We also believe very strongly, as a network and as a nonprofit organization, that conversations about the future need to be grounded in the highest quality evidence and data, and the latest available data and analysis. So we work really closely in partnership with state agencies and departments to collect the latest data from reports, glean key pieces of information, and to craft informative, accessible reports that pull a lot of that together. So for instance, our annual progress report for Vermont on energy emissions, the economy, and equity, which you see at the cover shot of the slide right now, is our report from last year. We're working on our next one currently. That draws on the greenhouse gas inventory that the Agency of Natural Resources produces. It draws on the annual energy report that the Public Service Department produces. It draws on the transportation energy profile that VTrans produces. It draws on the economic research and analysis that the Agency of Commerce does. And at the federal level, Energy Information Administration and EPA, et cetera. We also produce, drawing on that, our own analysis with our staff, our senior fellows, and across our network. And I'm going to share a little bit of that today. A lot of what we've been focused on in the last 4 months or so has been doing a pathways analysis of the known, proven, and available technologies and best practices that together, and there's a lot of caveats here because technology is always changing, markets are changing, what we know about the science shifts from time to time, but given what we know now, some modeled rough scale and pace of what this transition will likely need to look like with a specific focus on the energy sectors. So, this is just a small sampling of some of the diversity of our membership across EAN and in terms of the public partners that we work really closely with on that data tracking and analysis. Many refer to us as an energy and emissions think tank for Vermont, and that does get at part of the role we play, although not the whole role. So I'm going to start with our historic emissions, which you see in the darker colors, organized by sector: transportation in green, thermal in orange, etc., going up. And then off to the right in the kind of more gray shaded colors are the targets that we will need to hit. This should say GWSA requirement, not goal, for each of these 3 milestones in 2025, 2030, and 2050. And all of these sectors are important. When it comes to this work, of course, there is no silver bullet. There is only silver buckshot with different sizes of shot in there. When I look at this, though, one of the things, perhaps it's because my mother grew up in South Royalton and always talks about growing up playing on and hiking on the elephant. What I see in the green and the orange here is the elephant in the room, which is the necessary focus on those 2 sectors that contribute the overwhelming amount of our climate pollution in Vermont. The other sectors matter as well, but to be effective, especially because of the language in the Global Warming Solutions Act, that we need to design emissions reduction strategies in proportion to the sector's contributions of emissions. We know there will have to be a big focus there, and there will also have to be focus in the other sectors. So this, oftentimes the Vermont conversation has to be a little bit different than the national conversation because of our sources of emissions are very different. If you look nationally, electricity is responsible for a far higher share of US emissions than it is in Vermont. And these numbers are old. The electricity emissions are now closer to 2% of our total emissions, whereas the share between transportation and thermal keeps growing from previously over 70% now, or the 2018 projections that ANR provided last year looks to be over 3/4 of our emissions coming from just those 2 sectors. So I want to talk a little bit about why this is. Here's another way to look at it. This is the last 2016 state inventory showing the sectors sized by scale. And, we can look over time comparing that 1990 baseline that becomes relevant for our 2030 and our 2050 targets. And we see that we have made progress in some areas in reducing emissions from certain sectors, but those have been dwarfed. They have been overwhelmed by the increases, especially in the transportation sector, as we drive more miles and don't get the full benefit of improving fuel efficiency because of vehicle purchase choices being much larger than they historically have been. Also increases we see in the thermal and industrial sectors from that 1990 baseline. And what that adds up to is that whereas, so right now we'll use a 2005 baseline because that's the one that's relevant for 2025. It can get a little bit confusing because we switch from a 2005 baseline for emissions for the 2025 target and move to a 1990 baseline for the future ones. But looking at 2005, our emissions per capita were lower than Maine. They were lower than New Hampshire. But because most of the way that our surrounding states and neighbors have reduced their emissions has been with changes in their electricity purchases. Our electricity has, relative to other states, historically always been fairly clean. We can always do more to make it low emitting, but now we're at a point where, as of 2016, Vermont's emissions are the highest per capita of any state in the region. Now that we're still lower than the US average, but if you compare us to our neighbors like Maine and New Hampshire, we are higher at about 15 tons per person. And maybe just to give a sense of scale, because I know that these numbers can kind of get confusing when we're talking about million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Let me just go back and say, in 2016, we were near, we were just under 10 million metric tons. What does that mean? A million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent is about the equivalent of burning a little over 100 million gallons of gasoline. So the 10 million, nearly million metric tons that Vermont pollutes each year is about the equivalent of burning 1 billion gallons of gasoline in a year. So significant. We can also look at this by income, not just by sector. And I think that this is important because I commonly hear some myth or misinformation out there about the source of our emissions by income group. I've heard it at the highest levels of government and in our legislature, people assuming that lower income folks are using more energy and are responsible for more of our climate pollution. And it's simply not true, regardless of how you look at it, whether it's heating fuels or whether it is transportation fuels. So this is from the American Community Survey. It combines the annual spending by income quintile of folks on heating fuels and on electricity. And what we see is that upper income Vermonters are purchasing and using more fossil fuels than lower income Vermonters generally. We see something similar when it comes to transportation, that upper income Vermonters, whether you're looking at kind of urban Vermonters or rural Vermonters, this is from the National Household Travel Survey, upper income Vermonters tend to drive more miles and spend more on transportation fuels like gasoline and diesel. We also see a difference in urban and rural when we look overall and by income group here as well. Here is annual miles driven. So I'll just note that this is the rural Northeast because we don't have Vermont specific data from the last National Household Travel Survey, unfortunately. But if you look at annual miles driven across the rural Northeast states, upper income folks, those who are making over $100,000 a year on average are driving over 15,000 miles a year, whereas lower income folks are driving much less. Those are earning less than 25,000, about 10,000 miles a year. So there are big differences there as well. And this, I think, is really relevant to our equity conversations. Okay, so drilling down a little bit into the sectors, let's talk about where the emissions come from within them. So here's transportation. The vast majority of this is on-road gasoline. The vast majority of that is from our light duty fleet. It's all of the consumption of fossil fuels for gasoline that all of us are making for our individual use, for business use, etc. The amounts from jet fuel and aviation emissions in Vermont is very low, as is other non-road is more things like ships and boats. Here's another kind of way that we can look at why Vermont's per capita emissions are so much higher than our surrounding neighbors. And it's because the per capita vehicle miles traveled are higher here. Part of that is settlement pattern, but it's something that we need to be aware of. And it's even higher than in states that have a similar rural settlement pattern, like Maine. This was one of the most recent years we could get comparable data for all of these states, but we have more up-to-date data that goes through 2019 that compares us to some of our immediate neighbors, including Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont, and we still see that in northern New England. This number for Vermont is going up in terms of vehicle miles traveled per person, and again, higher than the national average in those near us. Another factor here is that not just the more miles, but that even as the fuel efficiency of our fleet is improving over time, as you can see here along the bottom, we're not getting the full benefit of the increased fuel efficiency of our fleet because of the changing consumer preferences, which have folks moving from purchasing, if you look at all the new car registrations in 2012, 45% were passenger cars. Last year, it was 16%. Whereas, light trucks, SUVs, CUVs, the crossover vehicles, that's also in this category, are making up an ever greater share. Oops. Okay, so turning to the thermal sector briefly, most of the emissions here come from fossil fuel use. Again, number 2, fuel oil, the main heating fuel in Vermont, natural gas, propane. These together are, the majority of the emissions. We can look at this also by kind of residential, commercial, industrial. Again, this isn't an issue where the emissions are coming from some big entity somewhere else. It is all of us need to be part of this transition and solution, because more than half of our thermal emissions come from the residential sector, and about a third from our commercial sector, and only about 16% from the industrial sector in Vermont. So before I go to the next slide, I want to say that a few years ago, EAN began modeling the scale and pace of the transition that will be required to meet. First, it was the Paris climate commitment that Governor Scott made. And now we have expanded and deepened that analysis to produce pathways to help us meet the 2025 and 2030 emissions reduction requirements in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And before I get into this, I want to say a couple of very clear caveats. One is these are technology pathways. They are not policy pathways. So we, again, as an organization that does not lobby on specific policies, but that looks at the peer-reviewed science and studies and analysis, we are looking to see what are the new known and proven technologies and best practices for which we have peer-reviewed literature, and there are known kind of measures of what can we get, what can we expect in terms of their emissions reduction potential. We also looked, the Department of Public Service has done some great work on cost effectiveness, the cost of carbon model that they've developed. It's going to be further developed. There's more to do there, but we took all of the measures that they had identified as already more than cost effective, as in when you do them, it saves us money up front. We included all of those in this model, but we need to pause to recognize that all of these assumptions are at a point in time, and technologies are changing, markets are changing, consumer preferences are changing, what we know about the emissions profile of different energy sources is changing. So this is a draft, and it's a reference point on the rough scale and pace. So you've probably been familiar with this. This is what we were updating. We've added a number of more pathways beyond what you see here. These were the top 10 in the analysis we produced a couple of years ago. A number of these bars we're actually seeing go down. As we add more pathways, more ways to reduce emissions, we don't need to rely quite as much on some individual ones. But on all of these, I want to give a sense of the scale and pace of change that we're talking about. So again, this is very draft, but it gives a rough sense. We are talking about, we've talked about weatherization. Since 2007, the state we've weatherized, a little over 27,000 homes. Part of this model is that kind of scaling to, an additional 50,000 homes over the next 5 years. This should actually say about 147,000 homes. So like 120,000 more homes over the decade. That's important, not just because of the direct emissions reduction that we get from weatherization and the important kind of comfort and health issues for Vermonters and cost savings. It's also important because, you can do a lot more to help folks get off of fossil fuel once a home has been weatherized, and you can pursue these solutions over here in terms of different heating sources once you've done this, or you have more options here afterwards. But just to give a sense of scale, we're weatherizing about 2,000 homes a year right now, and this model's, more like 10 to 12,000 homes a year. Of course, that won't be linear. Of course, things are going to likely ramp up. You see, market technology adoption pathways, and they tend to have that kind of exponential curve function to them, which we're going to have to see across the board with a lot of these. And I should say this very clearly, this is not a prescription of what exactly has to be done. This is an illustration. These are illustrative pathways. So if you say, oh no, Jared, that's too high, we can't possibly weatherize 50,000 homes in the next 5 years, you can say, okay, well, we should drop this bar down a little bit, but it would have to be offset by a number of these other measures. This is not a menu of options where you kind of pick one and we're done. It is all of these working together and adding up. So, we can also look, I should say that what you don't see here, but you'll see in another slide is also a role for B100 biodiesel as a replacement for fuel oil and some other biofuels as well. On the transportation side, we look at everything from electric vehicles to alternative commute options, biofuels, especially in the heavy duty vehicle sector where there aren't as many electric options yet. The role of high efficiency vehicles like hybrids, etc. And again, you see what we're having to look at to add up to these emissions reductions over the next 5 and 10 years. So as a reference point here, I'll just pick out electric vehicles. Currently, we have about 4,000 in Vermont. This last year, I think a little less than 3% of new car sales were electric vehicles. At a minimum, we'd have to be about over a third of new vehicle sales in Vermont being electric vehicles over the next 5 years. So we're talking big technological change. The good news is that all of these technologies are proven, available, and many of them are cost effective that leads to direct consumer savings for Vermont and improvement to the Vermont economy. This is another way of looking at it. Again, this is very draft, but this gives you a sense of scale of if we're having to, reach this total emissions reduction amount, 3.83 million metric tons by 2030. This is a suite of the thermal, transportation, and then other sectors, kind of proportional to the pollution that they're already creating. There's some of the strategies that we have in those sectors to achieve those emissions reductions. And these are going to have to be adjusted as we learn more, as we look at assumptions, as we talk to different folks. But this is a starting reference point for what already exists that we can start doing right away to achieve some of these targets. So some of the key findings of our initial analysis, we'll be sharing this with Science and Data Subcommittee and with the cross-sector mitigation. We have the technology and know how to do this. To do so, we'll need to follow the best practices that we've seen in other countries, provinces, and states. And that's broadly speaking, disincentivizing polluting fuels and equipment, incentivizing the clean energy and equipment, and using performance standards and consumer protection regulations to phase out the sale of inefficient and polluting equipment. And doing so can mean significant cost savings for Vermonters and improvement of the Vermont economy. I'm going to turn to that now. Why is that? One is because fossil fuels, whether for transportation, which you see in the upper left, or for heating in the lower right, have historically been the highest cost and the most price volatile ways to either get around or to stay warm. And so when we move off of these higher cost and volatile curves down to these lower cost and more price stable curves for electricity, this model's using electricity for an electric vehicle, or for heating, think wood pellets or cold climate heat pumps, or wood chips for larger commercial and institutional setups, you can achieve significant savings year after year. So that's what part of it means for consumers. We actually asked the Agency of Commerce and Community Development to do an independent economic impact analysis last year of those thermal and transportation measures modeled in our pathways analysis. And so this is a bit dated. It will need to be updated with the new pathways. But what we saw was the possibility over the next 15 years for net consumer savings for Vermonters of nearly $800 million and decreasing the flow of dollars out of state by over $1 billion. And how is that possible? It's because right now the status quo for energy is it's not just a strain on Vermonters' budgets, it's a drain on the Vermont economy. So if you take all of our fossil fuel spending, on average over the last decade, $2 billion a year, about $1.5 billion of that, 75 cents of every dollar on average, drains right out of the state economy. All of these alternatives that the pathways have identified, from electrifying how we get around, using electricity efficiently as a component in our heating solutions, using locally sourced, efficient, and sustainable wood, those keep far more dollars recirculating in state with a benefit to the Vermont economy and jobs. You know, you think about when you purchase electricity through your utility, that's going to line workers and tree trimmers and clean power producers. With wood, it's going to foresters and loggers and truckers and helping sustain our working landscape. So there's both kind of consumer savings and there's a big macroeconomic element to the benefit of getting off of fossil fuels for Vermont. There's a big jobs element. I'm realizing that I'm running a little bit short on time, and I want to make sure to preserve at least 15 minutes for questions and conversation, but I'll just briefly say, you know, clean energy jobs are about 6%, or the last report, this has probably changed somewhat post-COVID, but we're 6% of Vermont's workforce, which is the highest share of any state in the country. With, if you average all of those wages together, on average $27 an hour versus the statewide median, which is closer to $19 an hour. So higher paying, good family supporting jobs as well. And so I really want to focus on the potential benefits from an equity perspective. This is really, the equity lens is so important, both from wealth and income, from race. Unfortunately, the data on racial disparities and the kind of potential disproportions in cost and use are not as available in Vermont as income and wealth related data is. So we've started down the path of looking at the kind of organizing things by income. Eventually, we want to layer onto this and recognize how important it is to have kind of a racial lens on this as well. But there's been great work done on this by Efficiency Vermont that's looked at kind of through the geographic lens of energy costs and energy burden kind of by region of the state in terms of the share of overall income that's spent on energy, the energy burden generally being higher in the Northeast Kingdom and in Southern Vermont. But this goes back to my earlier slide. You know, lower income Vermonters are purchasing much less energy than upper income Vermonters. They, you know, generally don't live in as big of houses. They don't travel as much in terms of vehicle miles. But lower income Vermonters are spending a far greater proportion of their income on energy than upper income Vermonters, which leads to, you know, a significant energy burden, especially for our lowest income neighbors. We can look at this again by the thermal and the transportation sectors, and what we find is that lower income households have been using and dependent on the highest cost ways of heating a home, which are, you know, fuel oil is one of the top 3, and resistance electric heating. You know, a full, as you'll see here, you know, a full 20% of the lowest third of income earning renters in the state are still dependent or still utilizing resistance electric heat, which is the highest and most inefficient, highest cost. So there are significant equity issues in terms of, you know, this gets to the split incentives with landlords and renters. But we've got some really good initial analysis on this, and we also do on transportation, which I shared earlier as well. Again, All right, there goes my alarm telling me that I've got to stop, so I'm going to take one more minute to wrap this up. And what we see is, again, upper income folks purchasing more fuel, driving more miles, but lower income folks having a much higher share of their income going towards their transportation. Again, Vermont 2009, the reason for that is that the data is old for Vermont specifically, which is why we've had to look at the rural Northeast to compare by income group and urban versus rural on these transportation issues. Just quickly, folks who earn less than $25,000 in the rural Northeast, the average vehicle age for them is 12 years versus, about 8 for, folks in upper income categories. Here you see the vehicle miles traveled by income group. Lots more transportation happening among wealthier folks. And the costs, that per mile, the highest cost ways to get around that presents a real burden for people is gasoline and diesel vehicles. So I'm just going to end with these key takeaways that we've already done a lot of analysis drawing on the great work of the Public Service Department, the Public Utilities Commission, Efficiency Vermont, all of the kind of characterizations and research and analysis that has happened on these known improvement technologies. We have the technologies and the best practices to meet these goals. But to do so, we will need a major focus. We're going to have to focus on all the sectors, but there needs to be a focus on the disproportionate share of pollution coming from how we get around and heat our homes and buildings. And that when we do so, we have a major opportunity to strengthen the Vermont economy, create good paying jobs, save Vermonters money, and improve equity because of the transition away from 100% high cost, price volatile fossil fuels to things that keep much more money circulating locally and put folks on cost curves that are going to be more predictable and lower cost for their budgets over time. So that's it from me for some initial context setting. I know I didn't cover everything, but hopefully that helped set some context and tie some threads together that will be useful for our work going forward together. And I just say there's a lot more that I'm happy to share in the future in subcommittees or that you can get through the EAN website as well.
Jared, thank you so much. What a great complete presentation. We do have time for some conversation around it. And if you could stop, yeah, there you go. That's perfect.
Did I stop?
Yeah, you're good. You're good. You're good. And so we do have some conversation time around this about how this kind of logic and thinking sets up the work, particularly of the cross-sector group and the science and technical group. I just welcome people's reactions to this, folks who have questions for Jared about the origin of the data or anything else to help maximize the value of this, really important input to your work. So reactions to Jared's presentation, questions for Jared. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, this is Chad Farrell on the council with Encore Renewable Energy. Jared, could you just for context remind everybody or myself what the total number of houses we're talking about so we can think about it on a percentage basis? Yeah. And I guess the same thing with respect to vehicles, Yep. I think it was 190,000 vehicles. What's the percentage there?
Yeah. That's a great question, Chad. So there are, starting with vehicles, there's about 578,000 registered vehicles in Vermont. The latest data is from 2017. The vast majority of those, about 550,000, are gasoline vehicles. So, we're talking about by 2030, a third of the total fleet, a third of the total vehicle registrations being electric in that model. I would also note that, you can also think about it in terms of like the annual changeover of the fleet. So on average, about 35 to 40,000 new vehicles are purchased in Vermont each year. That's about a third of the overall vehicle purchase in Vermont each year, which is about 100,000 vehicles, but 2/3 of those tend to be used vehicles each year. On the household side, we have about 260,000 household, and I should about 260,000 households in Vermont. This comes from the great report that VHFA produced on the Vermont Housing Needs Assessment for the Department of Housing and Community Development. So about 260,000 households and about 330,000 housing units. The primary difference there is that you know, we have over 50,000 seasonal or vacation homes that aren't a primary residence, which is, you know, part of the definition of a household. So, but that allows you to kind of work backwards and think, okay, if we've got 330,000 housing units, some of those are multifamily. So this, you know, division doesn't, you know, happen quite this cleanly and easily. But, you know, you can think, you know, the average water heater lasts about 15 years. So you divide that by 15 years and you can get the annual average turnover of that. Heating systems can, you know, vary 20 to 30 years, which I think raises this really important question of it's not just about the fuel, it's about the equipment. I've never met a Vermonter who I've talked to that says they like using fossil fuel. Most of us who use fossil fuel do so because it's what the vehicle we have or the heating system we have requires. It's what it demands to get us where we want to go or keep us warm. And so if we look through that lens, I think we need to, as we work together as a council, focus on that critical moment of the point of purchase of a new vehicle or a new heating system or a new water heater or any piece of equipment that uses fossil fuels. Because if we don't appropriately apply disincentives and incentives and performance standards and regulations there, then we're going to be locking in decades more of fossil fuel use that we cannot afford if we're going to meet our climate targets and if we're going to help Vermonters save money and get off of those higher cost and price volatile curves for fossil fuel.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Other questions, comments, reactions? Yeah, Joanna.
Well, thanks for that, Jared. Thanks for all your good work. I'm appreciating the opportunity to walk through this with everyone here. It's an important foundation. I think a lot of what you shared is really focused on the sort of our target of like hard pollution emissions reductions, 2025, 2030. We know that, and the scale of what we need to do. And I think what we spend a lot of time thinking about, and we need to be thinking about is the how component of that, which is the just transitions. And so I think this is a really important framework. I would also just echo that, as this is an iterative process, you noted like your scenarios it's an example of the scale. Technology is going to evolve. I just wanted to share one thing I'll put here in the chat, which is, as we're watching what's happening down in Texas, where people are still struggling through what I think is in part a global weirding scenario, there's one story out there that I'll share here, which is how some Texans are using a 2021 Ford F-150 hybrid pickup to power their homes through this winter storm, as just sort of an example of the technology is evolving. And that example, I think, speaks to resilience. I mean, and how we are going to use technology to really meet multiple goals. And it's a little bit of a tangent, but just to note that, there's such interconnectivity here. And I'm really looking forward to digging into, like, looking at how do we just continue to make progress. I just want to share that. Good food for thought. Really appreciate what you shared, Jared, and looking forward to digging in.
Thanks, Joanna.
Thanks, Joanna. I'd also
okay. Go ahead, Jared.
No, it's okay. I'm happy to. I want to leave time for some other questions.
Yep. Well, I see Abby's hand is up. Abby, go ahead.
Thank you, Jared, for that. That was so great. And I look forward to sort of pouring over those slides more in depth. I think your point about the critical juncture of the point of purchase is dead on. I will, again, take my usual tact of dealing with a vulnerability hangover after this meeting and say that this is something that I've come up against time and time again, and I've also watched my husband deal with, and he is a builder. And so this is something that many people are up against all the time. And the reality is that the incentive programs, I know that we talk a lot, disincentivizing is a lot more, I think is a lot easier. It's more top down and it's a lot easier to attain, but truly the incentive structure, so far as we have explored it for our own personal house, which is a 1920s house, are simply not there. The numbers, particularly if you're dealing with people who have troublesome credit reports, et cetera, it's just not feasible. I've run the numbers on all kinds of things. I've worked through the scenarios of heat pumps with my plumber. I've done all of the stuff. And it still comes out as something that, like, with the means that we have available, we can't make happen. And so I think that's really the critical juncture where we have to figure out how we meet people where they're at and sort of explore that space to help facilitate the process for, sort of your average person to make those better decisions. Yeah. So thank you so much for all the information.
Thanks, Abby. 100% agree, because the situation we're in right now is that even though a lot of these electric and renewable alternatives can save folks a lot of money over time, it's that upfront purchase price. And so right now, upper and middle income Vermonters are able to make that investment and then benefit from those savings over time. But there are some great programs that exist, the Energy Saver loan, which can be 0% interest, depending on income, through Efficiency Vermont and VSECU and NeighborWorks and Opportunities Credit Union and others, and there's incentives and grants. We're going to need to look at all of that so that we make sure that the costs of the transition aren't on lower income folks and that the benefits don't just accrue to upper income folks.
The one other thing I would just add is that, again, in my experience, some of what I think might be happening is that there potentially are a lot of really great programs and incentives, and it's not making its way maybe into the realms that it needs to. So for example, like my husband was bringing up the issues of the fact that there's no building code. We have this really strict energy code, but we don't actually have a building code. And he was comparing what happens when he works in Massachusetts with his licensing versus working in Vermont. So I think there's some really interesting things to explore there, and in ensuring who has and where the information is distributed to get those programs out to a different range of people that might not be accessing it. So even if that's our second homeowners, for example.
Thanks. Let's take a few more comments and then we're going to need to wrap. I see Adam. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. This is Adam Newton from Dynapower, member of the council. I was bluntly shocked by the per capita data that was presented and understanding that it's a lot based on, where various states received and purchased their energy. But I guess the reason for my jumping in is as representative of the manufacturers in the state, but also an energy professional and a business that manufactures a lot of energy technology. And I know there's many others. Chad just jumped in. I think collectively we have to understand that our per capita clean energy jobs in the state is an amazing asset that we collectively have to continue to leverage to bring solutions. Whether be that at renewable energy, be that in other energy storage or hydrogen applications, we will continue to tap the technology skills and leverage those. And I think Vermont needs to understand that we can do that and do that aggressively. And we got to get that per capita number going in the other direction, relative to our regional partners. I thought the data was extremely helpful, and I'm sure the cross-sector committee will absolutely value that information. I know I do.
Thanks, Adam. Sure. Thanks. Chris?
I could just...
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Jerry, real quick.
Sorry, just really quickly on especially the kind of having the highest per capita emissions in the region. I think that we can see that and be frustrated by that and then resolve to do better. And I think that we have kind of a tool in our toolbox that will allow us to make faster progress than any other state in the country, which is no matter how you measure the emissions profile of our electricity sector, and there are different ways to measure it, and that's a fair conversation that we should have in the Science and Data and other committees. But no matter how you measure it, we have the lowest emitting electricity sector of any state in the country. And therefore, when we electrify how we get around or how we heat our homes, we get a bigger bang for our buck. We reduce emissions more and faster, or I should just say more, than those beneficial electrification strategies anywhere else. Because not only are we getting the benefit of more efficient electric technology, like heat pump water heater, or cold climate heat pumps, or an electric vehicle, we're running it on the lowest emitting electricity of anywhere in the United States. And I would also just say there's a really important new report that is in draft form right now. It's soon to come out from Velco, looking at long-term planning and load forecasts. And our efficiency utilities deserve a ton of credit, as do all Vermonters, for creating an amount of headroom in our electricity system that allows us to rapidly and significantly do beneficial electrification. So beneficial electrification is, achieving benefits both to consumers and to, the grid, et cetera, through getting off of fossil things that we've previously used fossil fuels for. So let me just give it one very specific example. If you look at the annual peak load of our electricity use in Vermont, it was back in like 2006 or 2007. It was 1,080 megawatts. The annual peak load last year was about 880 megawatts. So because we've become so much more efficient in how we use electricity and reduced our electricity use, we've created a major opportunity to utilize that headroom with savings for ratepayers and for Vermonters when we efficiently and effectively utilize that through strategic and beneficial electrification.
Thanks, Gary. That's really interesting. Chris, last word on this?
Yeah, three quick things. One, I think what might be beneficial, this would actually benefit potentially from a focus group, is interviewing those who have both successfully used the existing efficiency programs, those who tried to use it but otherwise opted not to, such as Abby's example. And frankly, we've gone both ways. In my own personal life, we've made use of some and not been able to make use of others. And then those who just began to try and then gave up, and for whatever reason, because I think we need to be real honest. Vermont does provide a lot of opportunities, but we need to be real candid, real honest about what works and what doesn't. Another piece is like we moved to another house. We transitioned away from towards electricity, which meant we had to upgrade our service to 200 amps. That was about $3,500, very straightforward. That included like the $800 service fee from Green Mountain Power and the labor and the materials. But one of the things I'm thinking is, and this is one of the things that we need to back into, is there just could be some practical costs that it's not just the switching over to the heat pump hot water heater or switching over to the heat pump cold weather heat pump and the EV charging station. There are other parts of the equation that we have to take into account. And I'm not sure we always do that. And last year, you had mentioned that you haven't talked to many Vermonters who would miss spending money on fossil fuels. But I will note, and I'm thinking of myself as a younger person, there are some people who, frankly, whose lifestyles really are tied up with they're tied up with fossil fuels. They're into cars, they're into trucks, they're into the snow machines, they're into the four-wheeler. The garages are full of stuff around fossil fuels, and that's not going to be something that you can just flip a switch on for probably a lot of Vermonters who actually see fossil fuel consumption as fundamental and underlying some of the things they enjoy most, and that's a communications issue. I'm not sure. What's that?
Oh, I was just agreeing. I was just going to say quickly, as a ninth generation Vermonter who uses a pickup truck to hunt and get my wood pellets, I get it. I only use a pickup truck that runs on B100 biodiesel, so there is no fossil fuel. I would say that the tie culturally is to the vehicle or to the experience of running a snowmobile or having it's not to the fuel use itself. If we can do those same things, snowmobiles and pickup trucks, and that are really tied to our culture in a way that doesn't use fossil fuel, we still have that experience. I'm not saying it's just that simple, but I do think it's important for us to disconnect the fuel from the experience of what that vehicle or other thing creates. And lastly, just on what you said, Chris, about the heating and cold climate heat pumps, I want to make really clear that each individual situation can be very different, and we're not talking about one or the other solutions, especially from a perspective of resilience. We want redundancy and backup heating systems, and it's not just sometimes an apartment or a small home can run 100% on heat pumps, but oftentimes you want that wood heat backup, or you back up what used to be a fuel oil boiler running on B100. So I just want to make sure that as we have these conversations, there's nuance, and it's not just kind of one or the other. Oftentimes it's solutions in combination to preserve the savings and the resilience.
Right. Okay. So we definitely need to leave it there. And this has been a great conversation. And before we go to public comment, which I want to do now, I want to just confirm your next steps as a council and what to expect. And I'll turn to Jane, I'll turn to Secretary Young to just quickly talk about the next steps from the council standpoint, and then we'll do some public comment, and then we'll finish up our meeting today. So I don't know, Jane, if you or Secretary Young are gonna walk through what folks can expect from a council perspective.
I'm happy to, Secretary Young, but also happy to defer to Suzanne. But from a standpoint of the next steps, I really think this week will be about reviewing the subcommittee nominations and working towards getting those in by sometime in the middle of the night or early tomorrow morning to me, with CBI and I digesting that information and getting it back to you all for your next meetings later on this week. So that's the immediate next step, as well as I welcome the conversation that Sue started around the RFP and outreach and public engagement. And I might suggest that that would be an important topic for the steering committee to take up at our next convenience with respect to considering how the RFP is out right now and whether or not it will or can meet the needs that we've discussed here today. So those are sort of the two immediate next steps that are popping up for me, and I'll leave it at that for recognition of time.
Thanks. And just either Secretary Young or Secretary Moore, is there anything else you want to add in terms of the council's next steps and what to expect?
I would just reiterate what Jane said, that I would like to continue the conversation perhaps at the steering committee level on the RFP and output. I'm really very much looking forward to the March 22 meeting, and this has just been a great conversation, a great overview on a preliminary basis as to how the subcommittees are coming together. It's going to only get more robust as we move forward in March. So I do look forward to, I hope, some readouts in March on everyone's progress. Secretary Moore?
No, I very much say the same thing. I think you've covered it well.
Excellent. Okay. And Jane, is that a hand to finish something else up? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge the work with getting Zoom as the platform, which we haven't touched on. Wasn't sure if we wanted to quickly, Secretary Young, and also acknowledge that my lack of understanding about Zoom, because I'm a state employee for a long time that uses Teams, have just acknowledged that there's also a lot of great comments about the need for a public portal. And I think that's independent perhaps of moving and transitioning to Zoom, which I think we now have approval to do as a council.
Right, yep. And yeah.
Okay, I hadn't heard that, Jane, and I was thinking.
Sorry, that's why I thought that was what I acknowledged in the email around A&R having a waiver. Sorry, but yes, maybe I'll just leave it then. I apologize perhaps for speaking out of turn, that we seem to be making progress on considering a transition to Zoom.
That's great. I actually have, put a request for information out to ADS. I have some preliminary information. There are still concerns, and I don't know if the public portal is different than this platform. So we should probably talk about that as a steering committee as well. Thanks.
Excellent. Great. Okay, so let's do some public comment now, and I do want to emphasize what has been said several times in this meeting, which is the overall pathways for engagement and public comment are a work in progress, right, and need to be improved. And there needs to be more pathways than a public comment in this meeting, for instance. So that's a work in progress, and the message is coming across loud and clear. So let's do some public comment, and we'll take the time we need. We know it's 12:30 already now, and I'll just ask folks, let's do this in about 10 minutes, and I'll ask the council members to stick around, and please for this as well. Jeff, you've got your hand up if you want to go ahead, and feel free, folks, to use the chat too if that's more convenient than speaking out loud. Jeff, go ahead, please.
Well, again, I want to thank you for the opportunity. We're blessed in this state to have an organization like EAN who has been consistently working on these issues, over the last, I don't even recall, maybe 5-8 years that EAN has been around. They do great work, and that presentation was excellent, Jared. I'll point out that what all of those pathways forward require is electricity. We have done a good job in efficiency in keeping the electricity consumption down, the load down over the last few years. But if we electrify these different sectors in various different ways, we're not going to be able to continue to do that. And we're going to need to use more electricity. And whether it comes from in-state or out-of-state, one of the things that I think the council and the state in general is going to need to do is to think about a more robust transmission and distribution grid. There's a big difference between importing electricity and generating electricity in state. There's a big difference in the benefits of doing that, and we need to keep that in mind. We have another advantage that we have in Vermont to many other states. I won't name any except where Dallas is that we have regulated. Our utilities are regulated. Deregulated utilities. I've read a story where an individual had a $16,000 electric bill for 1 month because he had a deregulated provider. With regulation, we can get a more robust transmission and distribution grid and design it for the 21st century where it goes both ways, and which we don't have right now. So I would encourage the council to think about that and use the tools we have to try to accomplish that. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That's wonderful. Thanks so much for that comment. That's great. Annette is next on my list. Please go ahead. And if folks can introduce themselves, that's wonderful too, please.
Thank you. This is Annette Smith, Executive Director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I have lived off grid with solar, batteries, and backup generator for more than 30 years. This has unintentionally informed my understanding of some of these discussions. So I have 2 comments. One is winter. I think that there needs to be a specific focus on the months between, say, November and January, which are always cloudy, and people are not talking about the challenges presented with those months. And that leads also to the need for backup generation when the batteries run down, because we go weeks and weeks without any sunshine. And I'm sorry, but there's also no wind often in those times. I don't have a wind site, but if I did, it wouldn't be generating a lot of the time. So the big generation source in New England is natural gas. And I think natural gas is the elephant in the room in terms of electric generation and the New England grid system. And I've seen a couple of reports from Massachusetts about it, but I think it's very important to start to talk about that part of decarbonization. And my other comment is related to the end of Jared's presentation, and that is that the wall that I've hit is getting off propane because of the lack of appliances. So I have a propane cook stove. It has a 400 kilowatt or 400 watt glow bar in it that wasn't disclosed in the literature. I have a propane refrigerator. I have solar hot water, but I have to have propane for backup because the sun doesn't shine a lot of the time in winter. Those are the things that nobody's talking about. But I need a low watt cooktop, and Amory Lovins had one. He wrote about it in the New York Times. He told me about where it was, and it's vanished. So those are the kinds of real world issues that decarbonization brings. And I have to say, I'd be sitting in the dark without propane, and I'd be heating water on a wood stove. So that's the reality, and I hope that you will consider those things in your discussions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's really good to have these real world voices in the mix. Carl, you're up next. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Carl Bayer. I'm on the Rygate Energy Committee, and we have a group called Rygate and Climate Change. We try to deal with certain issues from a town perspective. We have a solar array now, and we're trying to get a pellet furnace into our garage and our fire station. I'd like to see the council think about what happens as the fossil fuel industry declines, which I hope it will decline over the years. We have a lot of tradesmen and workers and small businesses that function in that way. And so part of the planning for transitioning away from a fossil fuel dominant society is how to handle the transition for those workers, those tradespeople, and those small businesses. And that's one issue I'd just like to bring up that I think that the council needs to tackle as a long-term issue. The second thing is I did see in I've been following the presentations as best I can, and I noticed in one of the presentations that the sequestration, the amount of sequestration in Vermont is declining slowly. And my understanding at this point is that we're not quite sure why that's the case. However, it brings up a concern I have about how much biomass. I'm not talking about pellets in residential housing or in schools or in small units, but I'm talking about these biomass plants. We have one in Rygate, and there's a few. And I have experienced by driving around Virginia in the fall what's going on in the southeast. And I did see the movie Burned, B-U-R-N-E-D, which I think everybody should see. So I am concerned about the kind of forestry that takes place. I do land use, I do selective cutting, but I am concerned about how much clear cutting we're going to allow in Vermont and what's that going to do to sequestration. I'm concerned about what's going on in the national forest with logging with no rules that are responsive to Vermont kinds of planning for their forests. So the question of sequestrations and the kind of logging that we're going to allow in Vermont concerns me, and also how we're going to transition these people to a less of a fossil fuel dominant culture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Carl. Next up is Donna. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm Donna Laban, and representing AIA Vermont and architects and engineers and all the licensed professionals around the state. Just wanted to just briefly comment that the cost of building well, what Bill Gates calls the green premium, that it's a weatherization issue, not just for existing buildings, but also for new construction and renovation. And even though architects tend to be kind of recognized as working with wealthier people around the state, they also do virtually all of the multifamily affordable housing and low-income housing in the state as well. And one of the points that was made by a well-known builder at the Better Buildings by Design conference was that they just don't have the resources to put in the most efficient equipment when they build new buildings. And so I think there's maybe a lack of recognition that the energy code doesn't guarantee, even though we have an energy code, that it doesn't guarantee that buildings are going to be built efficiently, because there is a green premium. Not everybody building new construction can afford this as well. So that we really have to engage pretty much the whole industries in bringing down the costs of what it takes to make existing and new buildings all more efficient, and you know how to make it more equitable for everybody. Thank you.
A barking dog challenge in my home office here. George, you're up next.
Can you hear me? Hi, my name is George Gross, and I'm speaking to you from Shoreham. I'm speaking as an individual citizen, but I thought I'd contribute some insights that I've gotten from working on our town energy plan. As part of that plan's development, I did some energy modeling exercises to see what it would look like to have Shoreham as a microgrid. And I concur with Annette Smith's earlier comments about the necessity of looking at the wintertime energy mix. And frankly, Vermont's electricity, with respect, Jared, it's not as clean as we would like to think. 50% of our power is coming from gas-fired power plants every year and the ISO New England grid. And so even though you might purchase your clean energy from somewhere else, in the winter in particular, fully 60 to 70% or even 80% of our power is coming from gas-fired power plants. So we need to open up the system boundary a bit to really look at the regional sources of our electricity and get them cleaned up, or this idea of moving to electricity is going to have some inherent problems because we'll end up building out a lot of gas-fired power plants to meet the peak hours in the wintertime when we put all our heat pumps on and we're recharging all our electric vehicle fleets. If you look at some of the stakeholders at the ISO New England grid, they're kind of trying to decide how to reset their strategic plan to accommodate the various renewable energy standards that are showing up in the different states. And there's definitely a disconnect between the grid operators and the various states in the region who have these equivalents to the Global Warming Solutions Act and renewable energy standards. Local to the town plan, I saw in the modeling exercise upwards of 50 to 100% increase in peak need for capacity in the peak hours in the winter time when temperature goes down towards zero and you have lots of heat pumps running and people still expect to recharge their electric vehicles. And that's for a small rural community of about 500 households. So another comment I'll make, one of the things I'm concerned about with the Climate Council's current progress is there's many pieces to this puzzle, lots of moving parts. Everybody sees a little part of the elephant, and there's not yet, from my perspective, a comprehensive framework. One could hang all these pieces together under one umbrella and have something executed as an actual actively ongoing plan. And I'd like to suggest that what you might require is something I would call energy policy architecture, something that structures the problem into an organization that's got a day-to-day mission of completing and executing the plan. You would have to identify its funding source, preferably it's something nonprofit. And I haven't seen a lot of discussion yet about the scale of the funding you need. By the estimates I've looked at, taking what I've learned from the town plan and scaling it to the state, you could be easily looking at north of $100 million a year in funding. And it really is important to figure out what mechanism would fund that scale of money for all the things we've been talking about, whether it be cap and trade system in the region or some kind of carbon tax. And finally, you'd have to find some way to make sure that those folks of lesser means are held harmless from all the improvements and things we've been talking about. And I have some ideas about that, but I've kind of run out of time, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. Okay, wonderful. Those are all things that feel like they fit nicely into the work going forward. All these comments that we've just heard. And so subcommittees can take these ideas forward, and we will be taking, we can do a process with Jane of figuring out how to push these notes and these ideas into the subcommittee work so things don't get lost. Okay. All right, folks, we've gone over time, 15 minutes. I appreciate everybody sticking with us for this 15 minutes. I think it was important to take all the public comment that was there. Thanks, everyone. There's more in the chat if folks want to look at that. You all as a council will meet again in a month. In the meantime, subcommittees have a lot of work in front of you. Thank you all for being so attentive. This is hard work to do virtually. It's a real pain. So thanks for hanging in there this morning. And good luck this week. And reach out to Jane if you need help. I think is the bottom line. Reach out to Jane. All right, take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. All the best.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, folks. Take care.